All right, welcome to the final lecture for Chapter 9. In this lecture, it's going to be fairly short, but we do need to talk about what happens when we decide we want to end relationships. So in this chapter, we've talked about, kind of the importance of personal relationships. We looked at how we form relational maintenance or relationships. We talked about maintenance of those relationships, but we know that sometimes, kind of referenced this before, relationships don't work out, and we decide we don't want to be in them anymore. Maybe if we go back to social penetration theory, maybe there was a violation of trust and we're pulling back from those disclosures. Whatever is the reason, but sometimes we find that we no longer want to be in relationships. And so in those cases, we end the relationship, and we do use communication to terminate relationships. Much like the stages of relational development, we also have stages of relationship dissolution. And so the first stage is differentiating. This is where partners begin to see differences in the relationship, or maybe differences in their personality characteristics, maybe sometimes the differences that they have that they once found desirable and attractive now become undesirable and annoying. Either way, we really begin to kind of see how they are, the other person kind of begins to get on our nerves, right? And if this continues, then we would move to circumscribing. We would begin to decrease the quantity of communication with that person, and potentially the quality of communication as well. So we may begin to spend some time apart. We may not, like I said, in the referring back to the social penetration theory, we might begin to engage in deep penetration, but really we are beginning to decrease our involvement with that person. Maybe we don't text them as much. Maybe we don't share as much with them about ourselves. We really begin to pull back. If that continues, then we move to stagnating, where we are maybe just going through the motions. We're barely talking with that person anymore. We're beginning to, feel like maybe strangers in the wind, right? And so we're barely communicating with each other. We're probably not spending a lot of time with each other. And this really begins to move to avoiding, where we are physically preventing ourselves or going out of our way or making excuses not to hang out with that person. So we are creating both physical and emotional distance. And this is oftentimes a symbol that the relationship is going to end, right? So in our friendships, sometimes we'll talk a little bit in chapter 10 about friendships and stages of friendship development. Our friendships generally kind of wax. We don't have this kind of terminating event, but in our romantic relationships, we do. We have the breakup, right? The interaction, whatever that looks like, where the relationship is deemed to be over. We are breaking up, we're divorcing, we're no longer seeing each other anymore. And so when we look at these stages, we know that just because we engage in differentiating or circumscribing doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is going to terminate. And so at any of these stages, we can have an intervention, our feelings can change, our communication patterns can change, and, thinking about things like therapy or, just engaging in meta communication, like, hey, I haven't felt really good about our relationship lately. I feel like we're not communicating as much. I don't see you very often. Do we want to fix this or not? And so in that way, we could kind of circumvent, we could stop the progression of dissolution and move back into working to maintain that relationship. And so we maybe see this in pop culture examples, right? Couples maybe even get to the terminating stage and then they get back together and they move through these stages again and again and again. But again, just even though this looks like a linear process, it's not always that way. We can move back and forth. We can stop. We can go back to maintaining the relationship. Yeah, so really thinking about, again, this is fairly simple, the different kinds of verbal and nonverbal behaviors that can occur at each of these stages. We'll talk a little bit more about that and specific to each of the different relational types in chapter 10.